There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that some of the most intelligent men in history, men capable of building entire philosophical systems, men who could analyze ethics, logic, metaphysics, and the structure of reality, also expressed profound distrust, suspicion, or even contempt toward women. It seems contradictory. How could brilliance coexist with bias? How could intellectual depth fail to produce emotional clarity? But the question becomes even more interesting when we look beyond simple accusations and ask something more uncomfortable. What if the hostility wasn't just hatred, but fear? Not fear in the obvious sense, not physical fear, but psychological fear, existential fear, fear of unpredictability, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control. The psychology of philosophical misogyny is not just about prejudice. It is about projection. It is about identity. It is about the deep anxiety that arises when a system built on logic encounters something it cannot fully dominate. Throughout history, some highly intelligent men constructed entire frameworks that subtly or explicitly placed women as inferior, irrational, dangerous, distracting, or morally weaker. And while it is easy to dismiss these positions as products of their time, that explanation alone is insufficient. Culture influences bias, yes. But culture does not fully explain intensity. Intensity reveals psychology. One of the core psychological elements behind misogyny among intellectual men is the need for cognitive order. Philosophical minds often crave structure, categories, hierarchies, definitions, clear distinctions between reason and emotion, mind and body, logic and instinct. In many traditional philosophical frameworks, reason was elevated as the highest human faculty, and reason was coded as masculine. Meanwhile, emotion, intuition, embodiment, and relational thinking were coded as feminine. This division was not accidental. When you build a worldview where rationality equals superiority, and you associate rationality with masculinity, you create a system where women become symbolically aligned with what must be controlled. Emotion becomes weakness. The body becomes distraction. Relationality becomes threat. Another crucial psychological factor is vulnerability avoidance. Highly intellectual individuals often rely on cognition as a primary defense mechanism. They analyze instead of feeling, they interpret instead of surrendering. They categorize instead of experiencing. Romantic and emotional relationships destabilize this defense. Women, particularly in historical contexts where men had limited emotional literacy, represented intimacy, attachment, desire, dependency, and dependency is terrifying to someone who equates autonomy with superiority. To need someone emotionally is to lose control. And for a mind built around mastery, control, and intellectual dominance, that loss feels existential. So instead of acknowledging vulnerability, the psyche protects itself through devaluation. If women are irrational, then needing them is not a threat, it is a weakness to overcome. If women are morally flawed, then emotional dependency becomes foolishness. If women are inferior, then intimacy becomes indulgence rather than necessity. This is not logic, it is defense. Another psychological layer involves projection. Projection occurs when someone attributes their own uncomfortable feelings or impulses to others. Throughout philosophical history, women were often described as overly emotional, manipulative, seductive, chaotic. But what if those traits reflected the philosopher's own feared impulses? Desire, jealousy, attachment, loss of control. Rather than integrate these feelings, they were externalized, placed onto women. Women became the embodiment of chaos the philosopher could not accept within himself. It is psychologically easier to declare something inferior than to admit it unsettles you. Another critical factor is fear of destabilization. Philosophical systems depend on coherence. They require internal consistency, but real human relationships are messy. They defy neat categorization. Love is irrational. Attraction disrupts priorities. Emotional bonds alter decisions. For some intellectual men, this unpredictability threatened the integrity of their carefully constructed worldviews. Women were not just people, they became symbols of disorder. And if you fear disorder, you attempt to subordinate it. There is also a historical power dimension intertwined with psychology. When a group holds institutional power for centuries, any suggestion of equality feels like erosion. Even the possibility that women could challenge intellectual authority threatens identity. Identity built on superiority is fragile. If your self-concept relies on being more rational, more capable, more suited for leadership, then recognizing equal competence in women requires restructuring your ego. Ego resists restructuring. Another psychological mechanism is idealization devaluation splitting. Some philosophers oscillated between elevating women as purer, nurturing, morally superior beings and condemning them as manipulative or irrational. This split reveals internal conflict. When a person cannot reconcile complexity, they split it. Women become either saints or threats, never simply human. This splitting protects the thinker from ambiguity, but at the cost of fairness. Another deeper layer is existential anxiety. Philosophers confront mortality, meaninglessness, and uncertainty. These are destabilizing themes. Historically, women were associated with the body, reproduction, sexuality, reminders of physicality and mortality. For a philosopher striving toward abstraction and transcendence, the body can feel like a prison, and women, symbolically linked to the body, become reminders of limits. Fear of mortality can morph into disdain for what symbolizes it. Another psychological dimension is social reinforcement. When intellectual communities are male-dominated, biases go unchallenged. Echo chambers amplify prejudice. If no one questions your assumptions, they harden into doctrine. Intelligence does not immunize against groupthink, it can refine it. Another important factor is emotional underdevelopment. Intellectual brilliance does not guarantee emotional maturity. In fact, early praise for intelligence can sometimes stunt emotional growth. If a boy is rewarded primarily for intellect, he may over-invest in cognition and under-invest in empathy. Empathy challenges misogyny, emotional underdevelopment protects it. Another psychological truth is that fear often disguises itself as contempt. Contempt creates distance. It establishes hierarchy, it protects from intimacy. If you frame women as inferior, you never have to confront your own dependency on them. Dependency feels dangerous, superiority feels safe, but superiority is an illusion built on avoidance. It is also important to recognize that philosophical misogyny was not universal. There were thinkers who respected women's intellect and advocated for equality. This tells us something crucial. Cultural context alone does not determine belief. Individual psychology matters. Some men felt threatened, others did not. The difference often lies in how secure one's identity is. A secure identity can tolerate equality. An insecure identity experiences it as loss. Another psychological layer is sexual anxiety. Sexual desire creates vulnerability, it creates longing, it disrupts focus. For highly disciplined intellectual minds, desire can feel like weakness. Instead of integrating desire as human, it was often moralized. Women were blamed for temptation, as if the existence of attraction were their fault. Blame redirects responsibility, it preserves self-image. Another dimension is authority preservation. Philosophy historically was a domain of gatekeeping. Excluding women reinforced the exclusivity and authority of male thinkers. Inclusion would have required dialogue, critique, competition. Competition threatens dominance, so exclusion was rationalized as natural order. But rationalization is not rationality, it is justification. There is also a deeper psychological theme, fear of emotional exposure. Women in many relational contexts demanded emotional presence, communication, vulnerability. For men trained in stoicism and intellectual detachment, this demand was overwhelming. Criticizing women's emotionality becomes a way to avoid one's own emotional limitations. Another important distinction must be made. Explaining psychological roots does not excuse harm. Understanding fear does not justify prejudice. It clarifies it, and clarity dismantles mystique. When we view philosophical misogyny through a psychological lens, it becomes less about inherent hatred and more about defense mechanisms, defense against vulnerability, against loss of status, against emotional dependency, against existential uncertainty. Fear is rarely admitted directly, it disguises itself as certainty. Highly intelligent men are not immune to fear. They are often better at articulating it indirectly. They can build elaborate arguments to defend an ego threat without ever naming the threat. But beneath the arguments, beneath the systems, beneath the metaphysics, there is often something profoundly human: the fear of needing someone, the fear of not being superior, the fear of losing control. And when fear goes unexamined, it crystallizes into ideology. Understanding this does not diminish the harm caused by misogynistic thought. It reveals its fragility. Prejudice often feels powerful, but it is rooted in insecurity. True intelligence integrates. It does not dominate. True philosophy expands. It does not exclude. And perhaps the most ironic truth is this: the very fear that led some men to devalue women revealed the limits of their own philosophical depth. Because the mind that cannot tolerate equality is not rational. It is defensive, and the mind that fears vulnerability is not strong. It is protecting something unhealed. When we strip away the historical layers, the intellectual language, the structured arguments, we are left with a simple psychological reality. Brilliance does not eliminate fear. It sometimes hides it better.